So welcome back everyone. In this module, what we're going to talk about is Audacity, and specifically how to get Audacity set up so that you can bring in the files that you created in Zoom and then edit them into a coherent show. So the first things first is that we need to download Audacity, and it's fairly light install. It also installs on Mac, PC, and Linux. So you can go to the Audacity link and download it, put it on your machine, and what you will get once you have it installed is what's before you. Now, there is one thing I need to get into a little bit of the weeds about, and that is when we bring in files into Audacity, we incur this error. Now, this error says that there's this extra little thing called a library that has to be installed, and the process can look a little bit shady, so I want to go over it really briefly. FFmpeg download page, great! So once we find the download page that we're looking for, you'll get prompted for lame or FFmpeg. Don't worry about this lame one because it's actually built in now into Audacity. We can go directly to this one and download, in my case, a package. Great. So before we install this package, I would encourage you to close out of Audacity completely and then install this package. I don't think you really have to, but it's always good practice to do that. You don't want to have something installing while you have an active application that's going to want to read it. So I'm going to go ahead and jump forward for a second. Great, so now I've installed FFmpeg. I'm going to go ahead and close this and go into Audacity again. And here we are, back to where we started. Whew, okay, so now that we got all that tech mumbo jumbo out of the way, now let's get into the meat and potatoes of editing. So I now have that library installed into Audacity. And what I'm going to need to do is go to my Zoom folder, which, as I mentioned before in the GarageBand video, all you really need to do is search on your Mac or PC for Zoom. It'll be the Zoom folder, not zoom.us. And when you get there, you'll have this kind of hierarchy of folders based off of how many calls that you've had and recorded. Now ignore this cool groove. That's just there so that I have a piece of music to use for this tutorial. You won't have this in yours. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the same file that I did before. And again, just like I mentioned before, you have an MP4, and if you follow the previous videos, I showed you the reason why this happens. This is your video backup, should there be something wrong. An audio merged backup of everything in your call that you can't really parse out, but it's a good backup. It's better than nothing and can save your production should there be something wrong with your audio record. Now I'm going to go ahead and go into the audio record file. And as I mentioned before, we have two files, one for me, one for my podcast partner. So what I'm going to do is no differently than GarageBand, take, drag, drop. When I do, after you have the library installed, you'll get this elapsed time and it will bring in your track and give you a sample waveform. What I'm going to do is do the same thing to my podcast partner track, drag, drop, and bring it in. And in my case, I'm going to go ahead and also bring in the Cool Groove track, which is our intro and outro music. Great, so now I have my intro, outro music, and now I don't have to look at that folder. So what we have going on here is a sample of what two types of audio, mono and stereo. And you've probably heard this before. Mono being that you just have one ear, mono, and stereo being that you have two ears. And we'll get to the difference between stereo and joint stereo when we export, so don't worry about that part at this point. You can tell that the Cool Groove is in stereo because you see two channel tracks in the same track layer. You can tell that these two audios, you can tell that these are mono because you see one channel of audio in the track for this audio. Same thing with this one. So these are mono and this is stereo. This only really becomes more important when you're trying to mix and match things. I can't just take a stereo track and willy-nilly move it into a stereo track. You can only move tracks of like kind. That's the only reason why I mention this. So the next thing I'm going to show you is sync lock or time lock. Now this isn't a Time Lord reference this time. What this means is that when we put things in place, there are two ways that we can edit. We can edit in sync and out of sync. And all that means is that our time marker for what actually got recorded and when we want things mapped is marked in proper time. So for instance, if I were to just take my selection tool and move this, I can move this individual channel of audio in the track. I can also move it down below, but I can't move it into stereo, as I mentioned before. And when I know that it's lining up with another end of a clip, you notice that you get this yellow snapping line. So when I snap this to the beginning, because I know Zoom records in sync, I know that all of my audio tracks are now perfectly in sync. Well, if I were to keep doing edits and stuff, that can be a little bit of a pain, especially when I'm moving, because now I have to kind of select and try to move things, and this can be a little bit cumbersome. So instead, what I'm going to show you is how to enable and disable sync lock. It just helps with moving things along. So what I'm going to do is go up into tracks and just click sync lock tracks. And what this does now, once you have things lined up, it will move anything that is attached to each other as either a channel or track and move them together. This is a huge time save. So the next thing I'm going to do is pinch and zoom on my Mac to zoom in. Now, or on your PC. Now, the thing is that this might not work well on your computer, or there's a better tool. If you notice up here, there are 6 icons, 4 of which are going to get you to happy hour sooner when it comes to making a podcast. These 6 icons are really the only tools you really need to know in all of the Audacity interface to get a podcast done. The other stuff that's up here, I'm going to give you a really quick rundown. And honestly, once you kind of see it and how it works, you don't really have to mess with it. You kind of just set it and forget it. But these 6 icons are going to be your friend. Over here on the left, you just have your play and pause. This is your play deck. Down below here, this is your inputs. So for instance, if you have a nice big burly microphone, instead of using your built-in microphone on your laptop, you can drop this down and just select what your audio input is. Audio output, on the other hand, my mic has an output so I can listen to it or monitor as I'm recording. You can also attach other headphones to your machine, and this also gives you another level to monitor while you're recording or listen while you're editing so that you don't have speaker sound coming into your show. Of course, we have the cut, copy, and paste that everybody knows, undo and redo, which is always your friend, and yes, Control and Command Z will work to undo things. Then you have zooms, which is where I left off. You can click zoom if your pinch to zoom doesn't work. I like using things like the zoom range tool because this allows me to kind of zoom in on a specific section that I'm selecting, as opposed to just plus and minus. Yes, my key commands still exist. It's not what you think. It's not plus or minus, and I don't know why. If you did command, even as I record this, I might make a mistake. Command 1 zooms in and command 3 zooms out. So if you want to use key commands, by all means, that's the kind of the faster way to do it. If you're really jumping in and out of zooming, is having one hand up on your keyboard and do your command, and then having your cursor tool to do other things. Like I said, I prefer the zoom range tool so that I can really see the vocal hairs on my chinny chin chin. And what I'm going to show next is, now that I've showed you the zoom tool and the plethora of ways that you can do zoom, what we're going to do next is do a little bit more editing and splicing. So to do that, what we're going to do is, I've already moved this out of phase, as it were, because I want this beginning part to have no audio of our intro, and then I'm going to go into the rest of our show. Now, the next tool to the right of your zoom tool is your track shift, or what I just call the move tool. And this is the tool that I used earlier so that I can move things within the track. I'm going to go ahead and zoom out, use Command 3, and I always get them backwards. And let's go ahead and snap it to the beginning of our track. That looks great. I'm going to use my zoom range tool, zoom in, great. So now, what I'm going to do is do a little bit of editing. And that kind of showed you a little bit of the move tool plus the zoom range tool. So the next thing I'm going to show you is doing selections so that you can remove things. So if I select one single channel and use my cursor tool, cursor works just like you would think of like in Google Docs or Word. If I select something and push the delete key, it deletes it. Now, if I were to do that for each individual track, even though I have time sync lock on, you'll notice that you'll fall out of sync. That's not a good idea. So what we're going to do is I'm going to click and drag and also move my cursor down one channel and have this range selected. Now, if I hit delete, notice that the selection across both channels keeps them in sync because you can see the snap line and gets rid of the selections that I made. If I go ahead and hit Command 3, there we go. I can also do the same thing, for instance, in this part right here. And I can select the bottom, move it to the top, hit delete. Yeah, that looks pretty good. So now if I push play, which you can do by hitting spacebar or hitting the play pause button. So now that we've done a fair bit of work, I want to point out that everything that we've been doing has kind of been unsaved. Make sure that you hit File and Save Project and Save As or Save Project and put this somewhere on your hard drive. Now, whether it's on an external or an internal drive is up to you, but one of the things that we see reoccurringly when the doors of the STC were open is people would come into our lab, start editing their audio, and never hit save. Friends don't let friends trust autosave, and you want to make sure that you have this project saved and then hit that Command or Control S frequently just to keep your edits going. Okay, so now that we've gotten all of that geek speak out of the way, let's go ahead and jump back into where we left off. Zoom, move, and your cursor tool. Now, there's a few other things that you may want to do. So for instance, let's say I have right around here. Okay, so right around here, my partner and I kind of had a little bit of a mistake. And so there's a few things we can do. One is that I can zoom in. I'm going to use my zoom range tool. And in here, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of on both tracks because we don't want to lose sync. I'm going to go ahead and select both of this range and go ahead and hit delete. Now you'll notice that there's a seamless transition in between both of these edits and there's no break. Sometimes this isn't optimal, and sometimes you want to have physical breaks so that you can move audio or resort audio. Well, to do that, you can hit Command I or Control I, and when you do, you get these little lines on either side, as opposed to just having a seamless break. In doing that, I'm going to go ahead and zoom out. Now, if I use my Move tool, I can move independent parts that those lines represent. Now remember, you want to keep everything in sync. So as I'm doing that, let's go ahead and I was on sync lock off. Let's go ahead and turn it back on. And now, once those segments are cut, we're able to move them in time without losing sync. Now, one of the things that we can do with this is, as we have things with sync lock and now broken, I can now resort them, and magically I can put things at the end, in between, and much like I showed in GarageBand, if I go ahead and shrink this because I love having as much screen real estate as possible while I'm editing. If we were to track, add new, and add new mono track, make sure that it's mono, otherwise you will not be able to do this next part. And we do this 2 times. Track, add new, mono track, great, truncate, great. And I were to take this section that I have, I can now move it in here, and these become B-roll. So this might be a section that you want to keep, but not necessarily have it in time, or maybe you're testing things out. So this is a really good technique of being able to split clips or Command I or insert break into your edits. Now, once we do this, we can move things and close gaps. There's also another thing. If you're not selecting a range using the cursor tool, is maybe I want to put a break in between just 2 specific tracks. Well, what we can do is I can click on the first one, click on the second one just below my point up above, and that will put it down below as well, and hit Shift. And you'll get this white line. So your playhead is fixed on the same point on both channels. And then I can just hit Command or Control I, and that will put a break in between there. Like I said, typically speaking, I usually do the selection range and then do Command I. That's my preference. And again, it's the same technique, whether you're doing the click, shift click, or you are doing the range, come back down, and Command I. Basically, it's the same thing, but there's 2 ways that you can do it: an individual break versus a selected range break. So if you're looking at your tech bingo card, we've done our move tool, which is the cursor, and I showed you that you can put it down into a mono track so that you can keep it in reserve. Now, when we do this, there's something else I need to show, and it's the same thing as in GarageBand. Over here, this is our track channels. So in here, we can tell that I have time lock on. That's what this little clock icon represents. We also have mute. So again, mute will mute this one track, and I'll mute this one track down here as well. And this is what I usually do when I'm dealing with B-roll. Now the other thing that we can do is solo. Solo is the opposite of mute, where when we hit solo, we are soloing a specific track, kind of like in a rock concert when there's a guitar solo, and it will mute all others around it. And I prefer doing this when I'm editing because that way, as I'm listening or soloing tracks, you can do dual solos by just holding and clicking shift and clicking on solo. This way I can work on just maybe my narrative audio and mute the music, sound effects, and perhaps some of that B-roll as I'm editing. So that's kind of the way that I kind of jump in between, is I typically use solo as opposed to going and clicking mute on each individual track. So that is mute and solo in Audacity. So back to our bingo card, our move tool, going through our tracks and what those options are, zoom range tool, cursor tool, and then our last one is our enveloping tool. Now our enveloping tool is similar to automation in GarageBand. This is how you can do your whole ducking and kind of fading in and out of audio within your project. So I'm going to go ahead and use my zoom range tool, zoom into the beginning, because typically speaking, that's what most podcasts do, is that we have kind of a track that rolls in and rolls out of music before we get into our show. I'm going to just go ahead and zoom out a skosh. There we go. When I use the enveloping tool, this I really actually, instead of calling it the enveloping tool, this is kind of like a waveform shaping tool. I really do like this part of Audacity. The zoom tool allows us to really get in here tight. So I'm going to go ahead and say that this part right here is our typical intro. And what I'm able to do, as you kind of saw quickly before, I can grab the bottom of any track and make it bigger so that I can elongate it within my view. And this is also a good technique to do, especially if you're trying to do really fine work. Seeing your waveform really crunched is kind of hard, but good for when you're trying to organize things on a small screen. I'm going to go ahead and use my enveloping tool, and I'm going to go ahead and shape my waveform. So if you notice, you have this gray and this light gray, and this double arrow. This I can use to add an anchor point, no differently than before, and then I can pull down the volume. Whoop, that's mute. Or I can crank it up. That's blowing a Marshall half stack. So what we're able to do using enveloping points is, if we add one, we can control the entire waveform. Add two, we can add a section. And as we showed in GarageBand, the taper in between is the fade that we have. So if I add a little more, we can control the fade even more to the point where perhaps it mutes out. And then again, we can shape it back up and shape it back in. All right, so now that we've done some enveloping, the other thing that we can do with the enveloping tool is that we can also turn up our audio. So as you can tell, in here, my volume of my music's pretty rockin', but our narrative's really quiet. Well, what we can do is turn up across the entire track, the whole thing. And then also, as I mentioned before, we can also add enveloping points in between, and if we have to mute sections, you can also do that as well. Now, by the same token, we can also turn down entire channels of audio or completely mute it. And this is a good way that you can do, especially if, for instance, let's say, and this is the reason why we recorded in Zoom the way that we did with multi-track, is let's say your narrative's going on and it sounds great, and then on the other line, your remote guest's dog barks. Well now, as long as you are still continuing and you didn't break a beat, which every good podcaster should do, you can come in and just mute that part that annoying dog yip-yapped, and your narrative comes through, your remote connection, the audio has been muted, we won't be the wiser as a listener. So this is a trick that we do a lot, especially in remote recording, because you can control things on your end, but maybe on the remote guest's end, something goes out of control, whether a loud bus goes by their apartment, or a dog barks, or some anomaly. And you have some really good audio and you don't want to lose it. This is a good way to be able to As long as your narrative was still going on one track, you can mute and hide it on the other. All right, so the last few things that I want to show in Audacity that might be helpful is your recording levels and your listening levels. So this is your playback. This is what the volume is at in your Audacity. And then this over here is also your control for what your input is like. Now I can't show you in Audacity live as I'm screen capting because my audio is joined. But if I was doing something, I'll probably put a video up here, you'll see that these dance in green, yellow, and red, and that's kind of the more important thing I wanted to show. When you're recording, judging by the distance of where you're standing or sitting, you want to have even audio as best as possible, so you don't have to come in here and do a lot of tuning up and tuning down. And the best way to do that is monitor using your VU units up here. And what that does is you can, as you're recording, you can see that there are green, yellow, and red. When we record, we typically want to have the top of the green, maybe living a little bit in the top end of that green and yellow, and maybe just flicking red. You don't want to just crank it up to 11 and just record in red. What will happen is you get this thing called clipping. And I can't really show you in any of the audio that I have here, but you can tell in my waveforms, I have distinct peaks, valleys, and then the top of my audio is fairly defined. When you have clipping, that is a region of audio that you lose data. So if I were to zoom in really deep into here, you can see that all of my peaks and valleys, specifically my peaks, stay within the range of the recorded waveform. When you clip a peak, these dots, you'll notice that they get cut or flatlined. And that's not good for audio recording. You lose data, and that's when you get distortion in your audio. So as you're recording, or if you notice that you have music and it's just living up here cranking in the red, you may want to tune it down and record or re-record it so that you live more on the top of the green and into that yellow range. So that's one last tip I wanted to throw into this video. Now, once we have all of that set up, we need to be able to get this out into a file. So let me show you. When we are all done, we have everything set up the way that we have. I'm going to go ahead and zoom out. Everything sounds good, looks good the way that we like. We're going to go ahead and export. Before we do, friends don't let friends trust autosave, and hit Save Project, File, Export, and you're going to go to Export MP3. And this process looks very much the same as GarageBand. You'll stick it typically on your desktop or your hard drive or somewhere that you're going to get it. You'll give it a proper name. Don't be too snarky. Remember, your podcast name .mp3 can be read if you're turning it into Canvas. So don't be super snarky about it. You're going to go ahead and pick your bit rate, which typically you're going to stay in preset. And I love how Audacity describes this. Much like I mentioned in the GarageBand tutorial, standard is typically what most podcasts, yours truly as well, usually output their files, especially if it is a long format show. The more kbps, the more fidelity that you put into a file, the larger the file is. And podcasts are usually lightweight audio files that are easily disseminated. Now, if you're doing a shorter show, like maybe a 5-minute, maybe 10 minutes at the max, you could crank that up to, say, extreme, which is 220 to 260. Gets you a little extra fidelity, especially if you're going to use it later in life, maybe for a portfolio, or if you're going to plan on using it for remixing later. This might be a good place. And then there's insane, which is archival. That's what this is really meant for. Typically speaking, when you're going to turn in a podcast, you're going to do it in standard, maybe extreme if it's super short. But do take a look at how big the file size is. It shouldn't be several hundreds of megs for a 5-minute podcast. Kind of goes against the whole ethos of what podcasting is about. Now, the last thing I need to point out is stereo versus joint stereo or force export to mono. Really, this should be the default and it should stay there. Joint stereo means that if you have mono tracks, instead of mono, as we discussed before, it's only one ear. Mono and joint stereo will say that same file on both sides of the ear equally, versus stereo where you can isolate a left and right channel. So make sure that you have it in joint stereo so that your stereo audio, say your music, and your vocals, which is your podcast tracks from Zoom, come in both ears equally and at the same level that you edited them in. We can then go ahead and hit save. Now take a look. When I hit save, and I did this intentionally, I put episode.3. Bear in mind that a period in computer speak means that it's usually an extension. So if you've done this, make sure you stay away from special characters, especially periods. I'm going to go ahead and hit no. It will kick me back to where I was saving, and I'm going to rename this to episode_3, and then I will hit save, and it will be mixed down. Now there is a few things that might show up as you're exporting, such as this meta tag stuff. You can just click OK because we really don't need to worry about it at this point. And there we go. Go ahead and go make yourself a cup of coffee and come back. Okay, and so now I have an MP3 file, and I can now turn it in as whatever my faculty wants it to be turned in as. So that wraps up this tutorial on both GarageBand and Audacity. And in the next very short video, I'm going to show two of the kind of major hosts that most faculty these days are using. And that's either SoundCloud, or what I like to call the gateway drug to all hosting of podcasting, and then Anchor.fm, which recently was acquired by Spotify.